afternoon, everybody. I'd like to call the afternoon session to order and to welcome our two next speakers one will speak on Persia's contribution to Athens, and the other will speak on Athens' contribution to the Achaemenid world. So we have bookends here, perfect bookends, and we're delighted to welcome them both. After they speak, we'll have a brief question and answer, and then we'll have a little break, and then we'll begin our final session of the day. So first I will introduce Professor Margaret Cool-Root. As I said before, I have known her since the Paleozoic era, and she is professor and curator emerita at the Department of History of Art and the Kelsey Museum at the University of Michigan. In her first book, The King and Kingship in Achaemenid Art, she kind of turned the classical world on its head and began people thinking about Achaemenid art in the ancient Near Eastern context and also, indeed, in the Iranian context. She has worked on many topics in ancient Near Eastern and classical art history. Most prominent, I think, is the publication of the Persepolis Fortification Archive seal impressions. These are tiny little objects, but packed solid with wonderful iconographic information. She has received many honors, including a Guggenheim, Crest Foundation grant, grants for studying seals, and of course this year she's a Getty Fellow. And her topic is one that interests me, and I'm curious as what she's going to say. It's Persia and the Parthenon. What did the Achaemenid Apadana in particular contribute to the creation of the Parthenon? So please join me in welcoming Professor Root.
Well, thank you all for coming, and Alexa, Rahim, and the whole collaborative of the Getty and UCLA Center for having us all here, and I'm just delighted to be back again. I've missed you all. I think this will be brief on purpose because I tend to go on too long. So I'll see what happens, and if we have more time, maybe we can talk together. In 1985, I published an AJA article in which I hypothesized the plausibility that the Parthenon frieze creatively emulated selective features of the Apadana reliefs. The Apadana, of course, crowns the fortified Taht of Persepolis, the ceremonial and administrative high place of the heartland capital of the Achaemenid Persians, overlooking a sweeping agricultural plain that we now know from the Persepolis fortification tablets to have been a much-traveled, well-populated, teeming environment at the very center of a vast empire. The Parthenon, of course, again, crowns the Acropolis at Athens, a religious and civic locus of the city, former siting of the Athenian tyrants and their temples, and now a grand enclave increasingly planted with structures and also freestanding monuments of a dedicatory as well as a political nature, all looking down upon the bustling urban arena of Athens, the city. Now, the article from so long ago laid out features of the relief systems adorning the Apadana and the Parthenon, features that signal for me critical elements of conceptual and structural similarity. I warn you that both systems are visually and experientially complex, and thus they both pose logistical challenges, quite severe ones, for presentation in tidy PowerPoint on a small screen in a small amount of time. So please bear with me here. I'm only going to sketch out a few formal elements for you out of this fairly dense article. to give you a sense of where I was going there. Both systems offer long sequences of figures converging toward a culminating central scene. Wait a minute. There we go. Sorry. Both systems offer long sequences of figures converging toward a culminating central scene that is the defining fulcrum. Oh, there we go. I'm sorry. The central theme in each is a defining fulcrum of the entirety. In both cases, these extended projections across representational space define a moment of imminence and ever-heightening anticipation moving toward center, a moment immediately before a gift-giving ceremony of some type or another type will begin. The dynamic center in both cases opens up to a scene of dramatic engagement, a scene which in actuality would have occurred in an interior space. On the Apadana, as you see, an official in the act of bowing to the king appears to announce that the nobles of the court and gift bearers from all lands are lined up and poised for the signal that formal events will begin. On the Parthenon, figures of still contested identification prepare the peplos of the goddess Athena and seem poised to move ceremonial furnishings into place. Beyond the scenic action indications noted on the central sections, several representational strategies played out across the expanse of converging figures. And these are common to both systems and help express the notion of imminence in both cases. Now, these include, briefly, selectively, figures with numerous vignettes of anticipatory behavior, such as these cues of imminence here. These are sort of dialogic clues, I might say, where representation is triggering an idea of communication in anticipation of the culminating act. And more of it, in this case, people on both reliefs gabbing amongst themselves, in some cases preening, anyway, again, entering into dialogue with each other in this anticipatory liveliness. And another feature, culminating, merging towards center in both cases, we have this moment of quietude that begins to descend. In the Apadana, you see it with the figures of the nobles closest toward the central panel where the king appears in audience. And on the Parthenon, you see it very clearly as well with the maidens who frame the peplos scene behind the gods, receive instructions from marshals and are standing in a very static kind of posture. Both relief systems, in larger terms, offer metaphorically laced visions of society, couched in the form of a ceremonial event. I've discussed some of the metaphors underlying the Apadana reliefs in previous talks in LA this winter, and much has been published now since 1985 on the Parthenon by me and by many other people. On the Apadana, and on the Parthenon frieze also. Not by me, but discussing issues of concepts of identity in both cases and many other issues embedded in the respective representations. And these discussions keep making the two reliefs more interesting and more interesting for me when contemplated together. We move on from the friezes. Critical to the argument of the AJA article is explicit recognition that Athens in the age of Pericles had become an aspirational empire, an empire on the rise in its seaborne sphere. That recognition brings with it a very real potential borne out by historical analogies, ancient and modern, to wit. In designing the sculptural program of an officially sponsored and funded monument that would proclaim Athens of this new age of Pericles, planners would be open to the ideas about what a certain other empire in the greater neighborhood had done. Indeed, such stimuli might actively be sought and deliberatively contemplated for their adaptive utility to the Athenian context. Text-based historians of classical Athens, by and large, openly acknowledge the imperial enterprises of the Periclean age. Widespread acknowledgement now exists of the Athenian adaptation of specific administrative technologies of governance and control from the Achaemenid Empire. There is, however, a cadre of archaeology, art history scholars who specifically specialize in the study of the Parthenon frieze, and as a group, with few exceptions, they tend to continue resisting acknowledgement of the imperial ambitions of Periclean Athens. I'm leaving aside the Parthenon altogether. I'm just talking about governance and politics. Despite interesting work to further appreciate possible nuances of Athenian cultural message embedded in the frieze, they continue to lean heavily on the idea of this Athens as a democracy. The implication seems to be that being a democracy precludes simultaneously being very much at empire, as we might say. And I should tell you candidly here and now, as a could-be, but never will be member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, I can attest that democracy and empire can coexist very happily. Thank you very much. We do it well. As a could-be, DAR, then, I proceed, now that you know my credentials, to talk about this. Yet this mindset, placing democracy and empire in opposition, is profoundly pervasive. This is one of several difficulties I see in seeking to keep discussion open on the Parthenon and Persepolis, Persia. So too, I have to say, a general tendency among specialists on the Parthenon frieze not to be interested in gaining familiarity with the literature on the Achaemenid Empire and interpretations of its official art poses challenges to having conversation that moves the needle much from this oppositional framework of West versus East to something more productive. Again, I'm talking broad strokes here, a thematic that I see persisting in the literature even today, and that's why this structure that you have in place here is so critical. Now, we must acknowledge that the notion of influence is very fraught. Casually deployed, the term does typically connote a one-way cultural power projection. Thus, the idea that classical Athens might have been influenced by Achaemenid Persia is very difficult. In the 1970s, the Swedish logician and philosopher of aesthetics, Göran Hermeren, addressed this misconception. First, he methodically characterized two preconditions for influence to occur in any permutation. Temporally, the date of the host environment's reception of cultural information must postdate the availability of the pertinent cultural information in its original formative setting. I made these slides. These aren't Hermeren's. He was talking much more sweepingly. It's one of my favorite books, though. So temporal precedence is important. And this is obviously definitely the case with the Persepolis Apadana and the Athenian Parthenon. Now, tangibly, as I might say, the host environment, the Parthenon in this case, must have had access to the cultural information at issue. I've discussed the Western trope of the inaccessibility of Persepolis in an earlier talk here, and we won't dwell on its proofs today. Suffice to reinforce, though, that we're operating within a world system in our designated time frame where travel, even from Athens all the way to Persepolis, cultural exchange through goods and services, and permeable social realms of being and displaying were the way things were. Take it from me. You've read the proofs in much literature, I'm sure. Now, Herrmann proceeded to explicate influence as a complicated discretionary concept rather than a unidirectional concept. Now remember, we're discussing official state-sponsored monuments here. Theoretically, influence in Herrmann's terms can be positive or negative, or any hybridity of the two. Freshly acquired or internalized cultural information can be carefully blended with indigenous traditions of long standing to produce something that may look normatively traditional in the host society, may look that way on one level, while performing on another level of citationality in a new way for well-considered motives. Furthermore, citationality of the originally received information need not even be intended to be obvious to everyone experiencing the hosting monument. State monuments had multiple readers, as we all know. I hope that in the long run, such discussion on a theoretical plane may relax attitudes among those inherently skeptical of the very idea that the Athenian state would ever have drawn upon anything Persian in the designing of the Parthenon. In the wake of the 1985 article, I completed a book manuscript in 1986 in which I expand greatly upon historiographic issues, theoretical positions, and visual analysis. The book deals with the two monuments in their entireties, not exclusively with their friezes. Since the initial drafting, I've continued to think about it and to gain greatly from classroom conversations over the years about imperial art and how it works. And across the years, various theoretical turns in the history of art and in literary analysis have complicated and enriched my perspectives. Let's name a few, only a few in these, 30 years. Post-colonial theory, feminist theory, reception theory, performance theory, social network theory, discourses on social imaginaries, ... so on. The project that happily brought me to the Getty from January through March was work toward the complete revision of this original manuscript. The aspirational imperialist ambitions of Periclean Athens remain critical to this fresh endeavor, but although the case arguing in Herrmann's terms the influence on the Apadana on features of the Parthenon remains important, the book focuses more on the abstract value of comparativist approach to reading the Apadana as entirety and the Parthenon as entirety, putting these two monuments as a whole in historical, visual, and experiential conversation with each other. What happens to each one when we do that, especially when we operate with attunement to multiple interpretive theoretical approaches? The Apadana is typecast in the modern Western consciousness as an imperial audience hall for receipt of tribute extracted from the lands subjugated by the despotic king. The Parthenon is known iconically to this same consciousness as a temple to the goddess Athena, a house of the goddess, with all the implications of pious religiosity and notions of worshipful performance that go with that word temple. even these very basic oppositional assumptions about social function shift when we examine the two buildings comparatively and with adequately balanced levels of evidence. I hope you'll read the book when it comes out and let me know what you think. And I do hope that if we have time for questions, you'll raise them, because I have a small arsenal of further images, but am so creeped out about talking too loud that I decided to call this one a very short day. So thank you very much, and I do look forward to hearing from you, input, formal or informal, today or any time after that. Thanks so much.
Thank you both so much. This is very rich, having heard earlier versions of both of these. It's all coming together in a wonderful way. I have a question for Margaret. Your article is a classic. I never teach Greek sculpture without it. I can't wait for the book. But I started thinking about the fact that, as many of us in this room know, Demosthenes famously calls the Parthenon a monument built to commemorate the victory at Marathon. Of course, he's speaking in the 4th century. And as we know from archaeological evidence, there was a predecessor. The Greeks started to build a monument, presumably to commemorate the Battle of Marathon. Between Marathon and Salamis, that temple was burned by the Persians, or it's destroyed when the Acropolis was burned, and of course pieces of it were reused in various ways. This is just a kind of interesting what-if question. Do you think they would have decorated it with this kind of program when they built what Boardman has called sort of a giant treasury? Because it's not the chief temple. The chief temple is next door. It really is a monument celebrating Athenians, whether imperialists or democrats. So the whole, because of the timing that you showed us with, X before Y, it would have been started in the 480s when Greek artisans were still working in Persepolis. So do you think this was a program that developed as part of the later period of imperialism rather than in the flush of victory, and we would not have seen, we should not imagine that the older Parthenon was decorated with a similar kind of ambitious sculptural program?
What if? Here, I'll use it. Yeah, I don't know how to respond to what if specifically, but I like your question a lot, and I not being sure how to respond to that feature of it. I would say that what we could have talked about even with slides is that amongst the many layered metaphorical values that are seeded into the Parthenon frieze, just for instance, and maybe especially, as you know so well, there are explicit allusions to things that look Persian, the goddess Aphrodite lolls languidly back under an enormous parasol, which I didn't make this up, looks to be an evocation of the great big parasol sunshade of the Persian king, and we know that kind of imagery was alive and well in Athens in vase painting. Sort of quips on it, sort of jocular body, innuendo-filled representations as well. So again, we're getting two valences. I mean, there can be a major state monument that's working with notions of royal booty taken from the Persians in war.
Which we know is stored in the Parthenon. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's where I go in the book, where we're talking about the Parthenon as a temple, but what does that mean? Well, all the ambiguities of that, and conversely, the Apadana emerges as very much, in part, a kind of temple. That is to say, a house of the sacral king who is acting as an agent of a god. He's not a god himself in the same way, but is definitely performing representationally and probably in body as an exalted essence in his house, shall we say. the Parthenon frieze ringing the inside the columns that surround the building, high up on those walls of the cella, very difficult to see, a little bit full of mystique, maybe just for that reason. But with these references, these citations of actual objects that look Persian, like the incense burners that maidens carry, right. Maybe even the fiale that they carry, although of course the Greeks used fiale as well. But these kinds of citations suggest to me, anyway, that again we're dealing with more than one register of notion, and that scholars in the past who've said this is a statement, pro-democracy statement against the tyranny of the great king and the threat of the great king. I think maybe slightly missing the mark because they're not willing to think about the possibility of multiple domains of citation going on, and that the Parthenon frieze itself. I'm trying to reach back to the initial part of your question. It's like, but about marathon and so on, as others, people like John Boardman have said very learnedly, that we may very well be looking at a representation of all these horsemen on the Parthenon frieze. They're very famous. On one level, at least, may quite deliberatively have represented or evoked those who lost their lives at Marathon, and wow, that's it may not be the only thing that's true. It's one issue, I think, but it does remind us of the kind of very nostalgic social statement that it reminds me, I should say, of the very nostalgic social statement that the Parthenon frieze is making. There, you don't see the Athenian navy there. You don't see the guys with their rowing oars slaving away, or all that stuff. Again, even that is maybe. I'm speaking very broadly, and there are representations of these hydria bears who may very well be people carrying booty in the jars, not water in the jars, and so on. So all these different registers, and I think nostalgia for this heroic past is one element that was surely perceived as a cohesion building element. But even that, it might be resonant more with the landowning Athenians than with the hoi polloi who were, slaving away or working away, as the case may be, making the city work.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you both for your talks. A question for Margaret. In your talk, you laid out sort of a Persia on one side, Athens on the other side, but Kathleen's talk made me think about the folks in the middle. Specifically the Ionians. And if one were to ask, from the viewpoint of Athens didn't have an empire, which of course it did, right? Why would an Athenian want to put images that could resonate with the Persian Empire? What about the audience who might be coming, not an Athenian audience, but the imperial audience of people from the coast of the Aegean, where you have cities which had been under the Persian Empire, and now we're under the Athenian Empire? Would that be perhaps a practical explanation for why this visual vocabulary might be something an Athenian planner would want to have on the monument?
Gosh, that's a really interesting suggestion, John. And certainly the issue of people in the middle is really critical in all of this discussion of exchange, shall we say, or entanglements between Greeks and Persians. So that's one thing. I mean, I think our papers talked well to each other in that, and it's really important for me to think about how a readership people coming from Ionia, very specifically, say, would have internalized the Parthenon frieze. I've thought more, I must confess, about reactively against a lot of the literature that's out there, more about how a medic, a foreign worker would have perceived being set to work doing something in relation to this, and also how different layers of society living, if may not being living as Athenian citizens within the urban setting, might have resonated. And I need to think about that more, because I firmly believe that the possibility is very much there, that people who planned this at the highest levels were aware that there were multiple readings at stake, and that maybe that served their purposes. I certainly personally think that it worked that way on the Apadana. The more I study that relief system and get into the nitty-gritty with different gift-bearing delegates and how they're represented, I think, boy, this is kind of mind-blowing. This is really multi-layered. There's more than one thing going on, more than one way this thing would have been read by different people, especially if you admit that some foreigners actually got to Persepolis and say, okay, how did they look at this thing? So thank you.
I shouldn't really ask a question, but it's these little motifs that you've picked up, that you find in the Apadana and you find in the Parthenon. I'm having difficulty with the notion that there was this degree of planning before the decoration of the Parthenon, that there would be, as it were, conscious choice, conscious citations. And I tend to think from, in other cultures and other times, that what you have are sort of ideas, motifs, and so on, as it were, drifting through the air, coming through all sorts of intermediaries, and then they may be, they may be picked up, but there may not be a tremendous meaning to attach it. Where the meaning really attaches is, as in bricolage, it's the shape that you make out of all these things. So I'm afraid I'm an ignorant skeptic. When I sort of studied the Parthenon in the deep past, you were not published. So I'm as it were an old style skeptic of this notion that this, obviously the artistic qualities of the two monuments are a world apart. So anyway, it's a sort of observation come question.
Yeah, well, I think my approach to the Parthenon is, I was trained as a classical art historian, but that was so long ago, one hardly remembers. But my introduction to Achaemenid art came rather late in my formative student years as a PhD student, in other words. And I mention that because I was blown away by what I started to be able to try to understand about the Apadana reliefs and how complex they are in terms of the backlog of multiple ancient Near Eastern traditions that were drawn upon in the formation of the iconography and experiential system of that representational imagery. And that amount of informed mining of ancient tradition and non-local, non-indigenous tradition, non-local to the Fars region of Iran, was astounding to me and suggested that I had ways of demonstrating pretty vividly the capacity of rulers, not least in a formative new age of sort of excitement and aspiration, excitement on the ruler's part, if not on the part of those who are being conquered, to create something new, but embed in it all sorts of cues about traditions foreign and very ancient, but still present in the larger environment of the empire, deliberately to create a new message. So that feeling that I think was pretty well researched, that this was possible, that this was a way that things can and sometimes do work, that the possibility of intense deliberativeness on the part of the planners of the Parthenon frieze in this moment of new aspiration and intensity, we might say, social intensity, could equally generate a lot of hard thinking about things, and a lot of maybe even beguilement with some aspects of what courtly performance of the Achaemenids was about. I mean, we think we have a pretty good idea that the Athenians, for instance, back in the Great War days, were very well aware of the bounteousness and sumptuousness of the Persian court and so on, and probably saw performances of kingship. I don't know, I hate to go here, but think of Trump and France and how he wants to give us a Memorial Day or July 4th celebration that will be sort of like Bastille Day or something. And oh my goodness. But there are some, and I don't want to compare Pericles and Trump. Well, I mean, I'm not trying to go there with you, but it's just the first thing that came to my mind about how people in power can be positively, magnetically attracted to elements of the so-called enemy or the vanquished enemy or some other range of relationship, the less powerful now, whatever. So I think that the deliberativeness is conceivable and is not untypical for phases of empire and very self-conscious deliberativeness of choices of citation and.
These two talks were both completely fascinating. I'm afraid my question lands once again on Margaret. It seems to me that when you talk about influence, one of the things that we're often looking for is a mechanism. So could you talk to us a little bit about the perishable materials of which zero survive? Where is the drawing, the sketching? These are clearly people who live by the hand. Whether it's the Greek artist or the Persian artist, they're thinking about line and form, but really a two-dimensional representation. Is it on papyrus? What do we know about, and here I ask as someone who studies the Greeks of the New World, who have some of the same misperceptions applied to them about what can be influence as well. But what are the possibilities of source material? Surely people who go to Persepolis want to bring a piece of it home. I mean, it's so fantastic.
Yeah, well, we do have some representational evidence on Neo-Assyrian reliefs before the Persian Empire, immediately before, of people in war, scribes recording things on parchment, while another fellow scribe is recording things on a wax tablet. And the one on the parchment may very well be vignettes of battle or of scenes, however, some kind of sketches and so on. And as you say, these things themselves haven't survived from Egypt all the way through. A lot of sketches on pieces of fragments of pottery called ostraca have been found, and on stone, primarily, chips of limestone or something.
There are no graffiti?
Yeah, well, at Persepolis there are also, but only a few that I know of graffiti that we might talk about as graffiti of artisans who are so-called doodling, One of them was taken as a trophy and is now in the Metropolitan Museum. But anyway, the point is that in addition to things like copybooks, as we used to call them anyway, works on paper, on tablets that record visual information. We also remember that seals, just for instance, at very small scale, but we know conveyed huge amounts of visual information. And we have a seal from Kathleen's neck of the woods in Turkey, in Phrygia, that actually it's a royal name seal of Artaxerxes, one of the Persian kings, who is shown in an audience scene that closely mimics the one that I showed you from Persepolis of the king in audience. And another interesting kind of thing for you is a stone sarcophagus that's called the Alexander sarcophagus, but it has on a frieze representing Battle of Greeks and Persians, the Persians' shields are seen from the inside, like, okay, you're dying and your shield is like this, that kind of thing. And paintings were applied to the stone, one of which is preserved enough to be seen, that shows one of these audience scenes again. And another shows another motif from what we know from Persepolis especially. And I don't want to leave you with the impression that Persepolis is probably the only royal permanent installation where this kind of imagery existed either. It's just that Persepolis is what we have in terms of a full-blown relief system of this sort. I bet at Susa there was one that looked probably something like it, but maybe in baked brick. But anyway, that's another what if, in a sense. The point is we have Persepolis, and we can no longer rest on the old assumption that it doesn't matter because nobody could ever get there. And as I said, I've talked about this in another lecture here, but there's just so much dense publication about how you could never see Persepolis. No Greek could ever have been there, even though we know that Greek artisans worked there and so on. But that no one who wanted to be a real Greek and had any free will would ever go there. And it's just not true. And it really does damage to our ability to talk historically about these things. So there are lots of mechanisms. And then in addition to what Kathleen has shown us about the permeability of material goods and choices on the personal level, it's really good.
Yes, a question for Margaret. Thinking about Athenian fascination with things Persian, and in the context of the mixing or confusion of Greek and Persian elements, what do you make of the tradition that tells us that the Odeon, the music hall, which Pericles had built at the foot of the Acropolis, was designed in the shape of the Persian king's tent? And also the phenomenon of Athenians or Greeks who Persianize, and I'm thinking especially of Themistocles. He is the architect of the radical Greek democracy, yet he ends his days as a close associate of the Persian king, either Xerxes or his son, learning Persian and dying within the boundaries of the Persian Empire. How do those phenomena relate to your hypothesis?
Thanks. The Odeon, I think, very plausibly conforms to the tradition that you cited, and it makes eminent good sense to me because the hypostyle hall that, as we see it at Persepolis, is well suited in a certain way for large group gatherings. So it's maybe a little bit paradoxical to some that Athenian structure, which we would think of as the sort of the pinnacle locus of democratic practice, might be evoking, at least practically, a Persian form. And if you take the great tents of the Persian kings themselves, echoing the monumental stone structures that we see at Persepolis and elsewhere. They were enormous things, those tents, and I mean, we can get a sense of that from the tents that used to be up for the Shah's celebration in 1971. So yeah, why not? These are structures perfectly suited to large gatherings. If you go into mosques today that are of the hypostyle hall variety, that's one way of kind of appreciating how these vast spaces with many columns can be a form of public gathering, of populated gathering. It looks different from this, but it served the purposes of what it needed. And what was the other thing? See, I could never run for president.
Themistocles.
Oh, Themistocles. Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. That is fascinating because for me anyway, it reminds us that one could be attracted to this other lifestyle, and maybe not for dissolute reasons. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be that Themistocles just wanted his own harem or something like that. I mean, but there was probably a lot to like about life in the inner circle of the court, and even the Persepolis fortification tablets and the seals on them suggest that there were many people who weren't members of the inner circle of the court in Persepolis or passing through Persepolis, who were well suited up with the accoutrements of appropriate living in, often very high-end seals that they commissioned and so on, and their networking that we can track on the documents, conversing with people of a much higher social stature, often up to cousins of the king and so on, or uncles of the king. They ate well. We know this from the fortification tablet, but seriously, much to like. And again, we not you, but many people tend to find that a bizarre story because we're so inculcated with the notion that it was creepy there and life would be very dour, and the Apadana reliefs are called frozen deadly. I think Wheeler called them representations of a pageantry of death. This sort of thing. And okay, it probably was not a bad place to retire in. And another thing that really interests me about what you brought up with Themistocles is that idea of learning Persian. So interesting, because I think there's also another trope that says, how could people have ever talked to each other anyway? And again, we have lots of evidence that gives us insight into how polyglot dialogues took place, literally, and on the Persepolis tablets, but also the idea that one could learn more than one language and do very well indeed. Some of our colleagues from abroad are test cases of this, and I'm humbled when I hear you all speak English. So it's a really interesting thing to bring up. Yeah. I don't know how you feel about it, though.
It's my sad duty to bring this discussion to an end, but you can continue outside, have a little break, and get ready for the next round, where we'll have several more speeches, 4 more speeches. Oh, at 4 o'clock.
Oh, at 4 o'clock. For 2.